All right. Good afternoon, everybody.
Good
Glad to be
afternoon.
back. We're back again.
Episode 3.
Episode 3. Yo, we're still here. We didn't get canceled or anything like that. So,
Not yet.
excited to be here. So, if you're new here, this is Bourbon and Bible Stories. This is the podcast where myself, Donte Milligan, and Amy,
Hi, Amy McMahon.
we get together, we have a drink, and we talk about the Bible and things that are adjacent to it. I'm a minister by trade and a seminarian, and a lifelong Christian, and so I give a lot of that context. And Amy,
I'm a teacher. Donte and I work together. I am not a lifelong Christian. Some familiarity with the church, know the basics. Have questions, and yeah, we're going through this together. And today, it's probably one of the biggest stories.
Yeah.
Or like one of at least the most well-known.
Yeah. So we're jumping into the flood today. So definitely a well-known Noah's Ark, well-known story. So really excited to get into that today. As always, subscribe. We're on YouTube at Bourbon Bible Stories on YouTube and Bourbon_Bible_stories on Instagram. So just subscribe, and tap in with us, comment, everything. We love the little community that's starting to form. Lots of repeat visitors asking us questions and things like that. This has just been a really fun process for us. So if you want a place where you can kind of think about and be challenged about the Bible and spirituality, but that's totally not judgmental or anything like that, that is the goal and the vibe of this space and this podcast. So welcome. We're glad we're here, and we're glad to be here for another week.
Indeed.
Another week, another month, but
how's it been going with you, Donte?
It's been a crazy week. We both work together in school, and October is an interesting month for school in general, and for life in general. I know y'all see it. We got the Eagles got a big game today. The Phillies are trekking towards the World Series, which means I'm up late watching a bunch of games. Then
you and the students both.
Me and the students. Then we got that colliding with parent-teacher conferences. It's mid-trimester. People got questions about their kids and their teachers and why they have a grade that they have. So in my position, it's been a little bit of a hectic week. But that's October in school. Everyone's starting to wake up to see who their teachers are and what their grades are, and the kids are starting to mess up. We're starting to realize it now. So it's been I got a lot of meetings coming up. I got a lot of meetings to do. But it's all part of the job. So I don't complain too much. How's it been in the classroom? And
Yeah, a lot of the same. We're getting to the point where almost all of the classes are having their first big test or their first big projects, and they're understanding expectations. And I had some really great. I probably shouldn't talk too much about school, but it was really sweet that some of my students actually gave presentations for the middle school students this
that was
week,
awesome.
and it was I would say that was one of it was a good teacher moment to be look, I'm so proud of everything you've learned, and seeing the kids teach other kids, and it was a really proud moment for
I
me.
gotta try not to get too specific.
Yeah.
But I forgot about that was one applause. That was a really good project, teacher.
Thank you.
It
was the kids though.
That was very, but you set it up. That was very good, and I know my kids got a lot out of it.
Nice.
Being in there, and it was a good moment. For those who don't know, Amy teaches high school students. I'm the principal for the middle school students. Her class of high school students did presentations for my middle schoolers on indigenous people and their rights and things like that. And it was cool just seeing them learn from their peers, and get engaged. I had to get a couple of boys, I had to get them right. They were a little too rambunctious, so we had to have a little conversation. But other than that,
and
things
especially
were good.
with such serious topics.
Yes.
Which I think is, a way for us to transition a little bit into our topic for today.
Yeah.
And it's chaotic week. Not only is school chaotic, but the world is in complete disarray right now, and just in the past couple weeks since we've seen each other here in this setting, the news about what's the Hamas terrorist attack in Israel, and then the ensuing war that is continuing to happen. And also for anyone that doesn't know some of my background, I actually, my first 2 years teaching really was in Jerusalem with Palestinian students in East Jerusalem, which is technically area that has been illegally annexed. It's, my students are like physically safe, but no one is okay over there right now. Right. No one is okay. And even when I say they're physically safe, they're really not. Yeah. I think I say that to myself to make myself feel better. But they're not okay, and a lot of people around the world are not okay. Yeah. And it's been hard to watch the news, and it's hard to, kind of process it being far away, having personal connections, and then, seeing how people are affected on I don't even like to say sides, because it's really not even about sides. Right. And it's so easy to go into that narrative of like this side versus that side, but it's really so much more than that. And for, our audience members, we also have been starting with a quote month, time.
I know. I keep saying week, like as if the podcast is weekly.
But yeah, last month when we did this, Donte had a poem that he shared, and I was a bit torn for where to even go with a direction, really. But as I was reading the story about Noah and the ark, for me, part of what was, I don't even know if triggering is the right word, but it kind of felt triggering to see the word destruction so much. Yeah. So like reading this story, seeing destruction, and seeing, like God's purpose is destruction, and we can dive into more of that later. But for me, part of what's been so horrendous is seeing the destruction on the news and seeing the complete decimation of so much. So the poem that I found is kind of reflective of that. So, this is not a happy poem. But yeah, this part of what I was trying to find in a poem to bring to start this discussion is something that's, kind of reflective of what's happening now, and connecting it to the story and this term of destruction continued coming up. So this book is called A Plate of Grass, New Palestinian Poetry. We can put a picture of it on our Instagram when we go later. We'll put it on social media. But so this was written after the war in 2014. And I think, I'm not going to get too distracted with myself with that, because I can talk about it for hours. But, there have been several wars with Gaza within the past, 15, 20 years. Yeah, sure. This isn't the first one, but this is the worst. This is definitely the worst. Yeah. But 2014 was also a really awful war. And so this poem was written around that time. Okay. It's called Only Stones Remain. Some of the background, it just says 27 August 2014. During the 52-day invasion of Gaza, 2,185 civilians were killed by Israel. And we've already surpassed those numbers almost twofold now.
Yeah, definitely.
Again and again, falling down on my head, and the dead are too many to blame. Only stones remained. Ahmed wailing, holding a stone in one hand, hitting her face with the other, screaming, "Where is my beautiful house? Where is my beautiful life? Where is my son I am looking for? I have his favorite toy. I found his arms. I found his legs. I can't find his head. Where is my beautiful child? Where is my beautiful wife? Where is my beautiful house? I am not talking about talking heads. Only stones remain. Again and again, falling down on my head. I will rebuild Shuja'iyya. I will rebuild every stone. I will rebuild Beit Hanun, that Al-Shaitan Zion destroyed. And the dead are too. many to blame.
Mm. I want to hold just a moment of silence, I think, just for one moment, because I think there's so many casualties of this conflict and of so many conflicts. And I think it's just appropriate in this moment to just take a second to let that sink in. It's such a powerful piece, and something that is so easily lost in all this is the casualties, and the mother, the child, the innocent person, and and I hate to do like a false equivalency, but like it is on both sides.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's something we have to recognize on both sides, but this is a tough one for just as someone that's involved in the church. And I put something on our Instagram. It was like a pastor who was like going off about the war very inaccurately, and I made a statement on there. But it's just important to keep bringing up, especially in this space, like as people who identify as Christians specifically. We need to do a better job on the whole of understanding this conflict, and really I would encourage everyone who identifies as Christian and who attends a church regularly to like have a serious conversation with your leaders or your pastor about where they stand on this, and really parse out their theology related to this topic, because believe it or not, a lot of us in the Christian space, when we speak on this topic and when we speak on it from what we think or believe the scriptures to say, and how we've been sort of positioned to identify with this topic, we somehow end up being anti-Semitic and Islamophobic in one sentence, and it's not becoming, and it's not Christ-like, and it's not how we should approach conflicts like this. We need to be able to clearly see the oppressed and the oppressor, and we need to clearly see that Christ was never on the side of the oppressor, and we should always be on the side of speaking for the oppressed in any situation. And I'll sort of leave it at that, but I definitely want to issue that challenge to our Christians who are watching, and I mean really anybody, but specifically because the church has in a lot of ways aided some of the rhetoric and problems in this conflict for a long time.
And it's hard because of how complicated it is. Yeah. Because since this is in, like quote unquote the Holy Land, it's easy to associate this conflict with being about religion. Yeah. And you can't fully separate religion from the conflict because of the nature of the land and how people are separated. But for me, so much of my lens for it is based on rights. Yeah. And what rights people have, what rights people are denied. And it's, ultimately, like, with this poem, it's, the right to life. And it's a right that has been violated for Israelis, for Palestinians, for Jews, for Christians, for Muslims. It's everyone. Yeah. Everyone's right to life is ultimately violated here. And it is really complicated. And ultimately, I think, and, I was making this connection before of like, one of the reasons I chose this poem was because I think it does a really good job of illustrating and giving emotions behind destruction. Yeah. And like I said before, with this story about the flood, it was hard for me to separate some of the rhetoric that's being used about total and complete destruction from this situation. Yeah. So as I'm gonna move some of my stuff around. I guess if we're transitioning a little bit to the story, like I said, this is a story I think everyone knows. Yeah. This isn't like, an obscure Bible story. I remember this from school, and even, or not school, but like Sunday school. Sunday school, yeah. And, when I went and actually read through the text, it actually does align pretty well with what I remember being told
Yeah.
about the story. There
God
are some.
told Noah to build him an arky.
That's right. I forgot about that one. Da, da, da.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, rise and shine
That's right.
and give God the glory, glory, children of the Lord.
Yeah, okay. I forgot that was okay. There we go.
That's a classic.
It
That's
comes,
a
it
that's a
comes
bop.
back.
It's a bop.
It all comes back. But yeah, I mean, like it aligns. Like, you know, my memory of the story aligns with what I'm reading in the text. But I mean, I guess one of the first things, like as I'm reading this, or as I was reading this earlier today, I did kind of wait until the last minute for today.
I was gonna say earlier today
to get into this.
I gave you these scriptures a week ago.
Got those A-push tests to grade.
Yeah.
But like for me, when I'm first reading this, like obviously you don't read this literally,
Yeah.
right?
Well.
Like, well, this is the thing is like I say when I'm reading this, I'm just like obviously I can't take this literally. However, I know a lot of people do.
Who do, yeah.
And I guess like that's kind of my first question for you is like how do you read this story? And yeah, like it's hard for me to see how anyone can read it literally.
Yeah.
I get that they do, but like I would like to hear kind of just like your overall view of, or like your overall lens for looking at this story.
So the stories we've been talking about are the primeval myths, and for the most part they've all kind of fallen in the same lens where it's like, hey, this is a story. It's the first 11 chapters of Genesis. These stories were meant to be, you know, quote unquote myths. They weren't meant to be taken literally. What is interesting about the Genesis flood, which is why I would never say take it word for word literally, but this is the one story of these stories in these first 11 chapters that likely has a kernel of historic fact to it.
Okay.
So it's interesting because it's
Tell me
not
more.
all
Yes.
like there are stories in the Bible that are like this is just translated history for the most part. And there are stories that are like this is an allegory for the most part. This is a little bit more balanced. So there are multiple flood narratives in the Mesopotamian region.
Right.
The Epic of Gilgamesh is one that's really well known. It predates the Bible. The hero of the tale is told by a divine person that a flood is coming. He makes a boat. He saves his family. I think there's even like a bird. They even sends out a bird to go see if the if the flood has subsided. Like there's a ton of parallel. There's earlier versions of this. So this story is not unique to Christianity or Judaism in any way, shape, or form. In fact, it's probably a polemic, which I'll get into in a second. But for this story to be repeated so many times, and they've done a lot of archaeological like digs on this, there is zero archaeological evidence that there was ever a flood of the entire world.
Right. Okay.
There's a ton of archaeological evidence that there were multiple floods of the Tigris and Euphrates, the Fertile Crescent region, right? Specifically, there's one large one right around like 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. So what's probably true is that there was a large cataclysmic flood 5,000 to 7,000 years ago in the Mesopotamian region, and as a result, and it didn't flood the world, but it flooded, the
Maybe
world
like
of the
their
people
known
there,
world,
right?
yeah.
Their known world. Like I always say, if people back then knew about 5 places: their town, the town north, south, east, and west.
Right.
And if all that is flooded,
That's
it
the
might
whole
as well be
world.
the world,
Yeah.
right? So, their known world is flooded. And then you come back from that and you have this sort of like etiology piece, which is sort of like, I always think about it like some kid going up and going, Grandpa, what happened when everything got flooded? It's like, well, and then
Let
you
me tell
start,
ya.
and then stories build, right? We are humans are a storytelling people. And so as we, develop these stories, they get tied to divinity. And just like, I think I talked about this in the creation story, and I think this was Walter Bugerman. He's a really well-renowned Old Testament scholar, and I read a lot of his commentary for this particular story as well. But he always talks about these stories, and it's like they're important not for the history they represent, for the theology they develop. They're not trying to teach you about history. They're trying to talk about God. And so even this story, it's drawing on older stories, again, probably some kernel of truth, but it's not about getting into the minutia of whether or not it was possible for an 80-year-old man to build a wooden boat over 81 years that's 500 feet long, when we have no evidence that anyone was able to build boats that big at that time, right? And like get every species in the world, hundreds of thousands of species of animals onto, but like there's like digging into all of that is for me, and this is a personal opinion, a little bit like irrelevant.
Right.
Like the story is about so much more. It talks about divine judgment. It talks about morality. It parallels other stories. So it's like, how are they presenting God and how are we going to present God? Like we should be thinking on a higher plane about how this story is meaning to represent God versus arguing about whether or not it was possible for this whole world flood. So I personally don't take it literally, but in a way that's different from the creation story. There is probably some literal truth to it. It is reflecting on probably some event. It's just not describing that particular event in detail, and it's not that's not the purpose of the story.
So when we're talking about theology here and like, you know, this story representing God, I think, you know, one of the first issues I'm having as I'm reading this is why?
Yeah.
Why? Like it's not fully explained. God doesn't really say why. He just says, okay, and this is the quote I wrote here: "My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh." Okay, no, that's actually, I don't think that's the quote I intended. But basically,
it's
just
like the judgment quote. It's in the it's in like the first 6 verses.
Why?
Yeah.
What did man do that was so horrible that you want to wipe mankind out of existence and start anew? So, like, and I'm kind of putting together, you know, this, what you're saying. Yes, there's some fact to this. Yes, also take it with, you know, the story and the meaning. But what is this saying about God if he, like, one, like, fucked up the human race this bad on his first time, and then just wants to destroy everything? And like I said, you know, like, I keep making these connections back to Gaza of, like, you know, like, God just arbitrarily saying he just wants to, like, the complete destruction of mankind. Right. Like, that has an effect too. And even if, you know, I mean, you know, people you might not know, I don't fully buy into the whole religion thing. Right. And this is just a really hard thing for me to reconcile of, like, what do we know about God from this? Like, what went so wrong that he would want to have this kind of destruction? Even though we don't know these people, they still died too. Right. And had these horrendous, like...
So what you're focusing on is the biggest challenge in reading this, because I think that the original authors never intended us to... never thought that people would, first of all, would read the story literally, but second of all, would focus on the humanity that died. Because the humanity that died, as far as the composition of this story is concerned, is just like they're just a character in this story that they're telling to tell a larger lesson. So they're like, and then God had to wipe out all humanity. But this is what we learn from it. And like, they don't expect anyone to be like, but wait, what about those people? Because those people just represent a failed society. And I think there's a few things to sort of give context to this. One is the polemic nature of this. And so when I use that word polemic, it's a word
I don't know what that means.
Good. So a polemic is when there's a story or thing that already exists in a particular culture, religion, belief system, whatever, and you tell the same story, but you change things to compete with or to trump what the other culture is saying. So let's take the Epic of Gilgamesh and let's take that flood story. Because remember, the Bible is the latest flood story. There were multiple flood stories previous to this. The Epic of Gilgamesh is written, let me go back, about 1100 BCE, right? The earliest parts of the Bible we think were written around like 950 BC. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is at least 150 years older and probably more than the biblical account. So it had been around. They knew this story. It's like The Boy Who Cried Wolf. It's a story everybody knows. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, first of all, there's multiple deities, not one. The deity wants to destroy humanity, not because they've fucked up morally or anything like that. The deity wants to destroy humanity because they keep him up at night. And he's trying to go to sleep. So it's this arbitrary, those humans are annoying. The human in the story only can find out about God's plan because a different God wants to tell him. And has to sneak behind the back of the other God. That other God that wants to tell humanity is limited with what he can share to humanity. So, and it changes in different iterations of the story. But like one of the iterations is he talks to a reed wall, knowing that the human can hear him. So he has to sneak behind the back of the one God that's going to start the flood to sneakily tell the humans. Then the humans have to like come up with this secret plan to build a boat and to survive the cataclysm. So if our early, Jewish, and I mean, they wouldn't be Jewish at this time, but, for this lack of a better term, Jewish authors are putting this story together and they're competing with what the story used to be in a polemic nature. First of all, they're going to have one God and not many. Right. So already they're making a statement. Our God isn't competing with a bunch of other gods who can confuse him or sneak behind his back. Our God knows all. Secondly, our God is not going.
He knows all, but he fucked up his first civilization.
Yeah, well, I'll get there. Hold up.
Okay.
So our God, first of all, doesn't have all these other gods that he's competing with. Second, our God, what was I going to say? Our God doesn't. The whole like arbitrary nature of it. Our God didn't send a flood because he was sick of humans waking him up at night. Our God sent a flood because there was a moral problem. Now, again, we can definitely criticize that, like, should the consequences of morality be death or destruction of all mankind? That's a valid question. But again, view it in comparison with what came before it. What came before it was a God who was just like annoyed and was like, I'll just kill everybody. And so they rewrite it to say, our God, right? Yeah, again, Adonai.
So they changed the justification, but they didn't change the end outcome.
Exactly, the justification. So the end out again because the story is well known, right?
Right.
It's the flood narrative. So they're like, no, we'll take the same narrative, we'll take the same outcome, but the justification is that, society was morally flawed. The other thing, and this gets glossed over, and it gets glossed over in church. Like a lot of church people mess this up, and I've heard pastors preach on this, and they'll go, and this is an example of God's wrath. Y'all gotta, like, I remember listening to a guy and he was like, God is not nice, and he was using this as an example, and he was like, people drowned and there were bodies floating, like he had this really like vivid violent thing to like prove that like if you don't listen to God, this could be the result. But if you read the text, God is not angry. God is very sad. God is very, very sad that his creation isn't working. And that leads us to the next point that a lot of scholars point to that doesn't always make it to the church pews, but that scholars point to is that this may very well be a different creation account. Because if you look at the earlier creation accounts, they all, and even other creation accounts from other religions, they all start from water. Right, water represents chaos for obvious reasons, like the ocean is chaotic. So it always represents chaos, and then you have a God or a divine being that can make order of chaos. And so the idea that God would have made something, it didn't work. God is saddened by that and says, I have to start over because I have to create a creation that can live according to my purpose, and then wipe it out, recreate it from the waters, keep the people who were living according to God's purpose, and then restart. And even when Noah is done and the waters recede, the first thing that happens is a sacrifice, right? He builds an altar, like, so it's this complete reset and restart. So I think the commentary, at least at the time, was about like the idea was, and again, they're probably not taking it literally at the time. Right. So they're telling this story to illustrate this idea of like, we are so important to God. Our relationship is so important to God that God would hypothetically, if we weren't right, erase it and start again. Right. And so you are as a creation good enough Because if you weren't, God would have wiped you out to start again. Like, and so
but that's
yeah,
also
go
hard
ahead.
when you see like what the fuck is happening over here,
Right,
and it's just
right.
like, and sorry, I mean, I'm
No,
getting
you're-
kind of distracted, but it's like this is the worst of society. This is the worst of the world. It's like,
And I
what
think-
the fuck is happening?
And
here?
I think that's the critique that they didn't anticipate that I think is the most valid. So if you're saying that at one point, and the other thing, I think the one thing I didn't get to that I think is important to point out is that it also ends with a promise to never do this again.
Oh yeah,
Right.
yeah, and then we have a rainbow and everything's all happy.
Right.
Yeah.
And I do think that the point of that again is sort of, well, two, it's an ideology, right? Grandpa, where did the rainbow come from? Well, the rainbow is, and there's kind of that piece of it, but there's also just sort of like, because you can't tell this story and then have people not be scared that it's going to happen to them. So you go like, well, no,
Right.
God wouldn't do that now. That was a different thing. But again, like the idea is to represent, society at the time, definitely the Israelites at the time, but even, we could bring it to us today as like, we are God's creation and God is happy with us so long as we live within his will, because, God has messed up before and has, redone, and now we're the, the perfect, not perfect, but the better iteration of creation. And that's sort of what the story points to and what it looks at. But the valid critique is like, well, if we're so good, why are we still killing each other all the time and everything like that? Maybe we do need a flood in certain parts of the world if people can't stop killing each other. And I do think it brings up really interesting questions about the nature of God. Like, is God a God of genocide? Is God a God that will wipe people out? Is God a God that allows for destruction? And why does God allow for destruction? Even asking questions of cataclysms like floods and earthquakes and things like that. Like, why would God allow for these things to happen? And I think that the other part of this is like, people are trying to bring purpose to something that is devastating, like a flood. So they add a moral tinge to it. Like, well, and all it really is to say is like, if you have purpose on your life, God will find a way to bring you through it. And what we often don't talk about in those conversations is what happens to the people that don't get brought through it, right? And I think we've talked about this before, but like, my mother died of cancer rather suddenly, right? Your father passed away rather suddenly, right? And so every time someone's healed of something, we go, see, God will bring you through. But
on
what
the
was
other
wrong?
end,
What was wrong with my mom? What was wrong with your dad? Why couldn't they get pulled through, right? And so I think those are really
and all
valid.
of these thousands of innocent people that have died like in this current conflict.
And I think that those are really valid things to struggle with. And I think that, as a clergy member and as the church, like what we really want to do is be like, no, it's fine, and like try to cover it up. But like, it is valid to say like, okay, I see where the story is positioned, and maybe it's not positioned to just be this like, literal mass genocide. But at the same time, like, there's a lot of destruction happening in the world, and how am I supposed to interpret that in relation to God? What's interesting is, so I was at church this morning, and as soon as the pastor said this, it immediately made me think of the podcast today. But she was like, and she got this from somewhere else, but she said it to the congregation. She was like, I look at the world, I look at everything happen, and I cry out to God, and I go, God, why are you allowing so much oppression? Why are you allowing so much injustice? Why won't you do something about it? But I don't say it because I'm scared he'll ask me the same question. And the idea is like, and that theologian that I read last week, she said it like this: God has no hands to work in the world but ours. So I think the other piece of the big question of, well, why is all this injustice happening, or why is this happening? Why, the things in the Gaza Strip and things like that is like, if you believe that God incarnate, right, the Holy Spirit is within you as a Christian, then you should believe that you have the divine purpose and power to go out and fix the atrocities of the world. So sometimes when I look at destruction in the world, I'm tempted to go, God, why are you allowing this? But what always comes back to me is, why am I allowing this? If I truly believe that the presence of God is alive within me, then that means that me and everyone else who says that we hold the Holy Spirit in our heart have all the power in the world to do something about this. So maybe we got to stop blaming God. Maybe we got to start blaming ourselves.
No, I mean, I think it's a fair point. Unprecedented move for our podcast. I really need to pee.
No, take a pee break.
Okay, real fast. I don't know if we need to pause or come back.
No,
okay.
keep going. People take bathroom breaks on pods all the time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Here we go. Won't knock anything.
So this podcast is brought to you by. No, I'm playing. It's good though. No, this is good. Knew this would be a good episode. Yeah, it's a lot of. I mean, and it's it's with everything that's going on, and she's so close to it. But it's just such a, I think as the church and as Christians, we just have to be so much better at being vulnerable. Like no pastor wants to stand up there and go, I don't know why all this happens. It sucks, and I don't know why it happens. But like it's real. Like I'd be lying if I sat here and I'm like, no, I know the divine purpose of every atrocity that. Like I'd be lying.
I mean, you don't say you know that, just know there is one.
Yeah. Not even that. I have faith that there is one.
Yes.
Like it's not. I don't know.
Right.
Like I'm gonna keep it a buck. I have no idea. Like I won't begin to try to pretend I know the purpose of these wars and these things like that, but I do genuinely, and I think this is the challenge of faith, is being able to say you have faith in something that you cannot see, right? I have hope for things unseen. Like I don't know, but I think that's what keeps me going every day. Is like I know it sucks, but I have to believe in a divine plan for this, and I have to believe that I'm a part of it too. I think where I would critique the church is the church will say, no, God has a purpose for the wars, and then they'll go on and do their own thing. But like, if God has a purpose, then we're a part of it. We got to get up and do something about it.
So apologies, thank you. I thought my teacher bladder could hold me a little bit longer.
Yeah.
But, well, okay. When you were talking with that though, I was actually thinking about a lot of my former students in Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And I had this really funny group of boys who, a lot of teachers here, you can complain about duties. We had lunch duty every day, so I didn't get to eat my lunch, stood out on the blacktop.
It's the worst.
Supervised. It is what it is. Yeah. But this group of boys would come over to me almost every day, and they were used to a lot of teachers that were Christian. Okay.
Yeah.
And I remember, they would ask me and start to ask me like, well, miss, like, you must believe in this. You must believe in this. And I was like, actually, I don't believe in any of it really. Mm-hmm. And that was even more confounding for them.
Yeah.
And they were, with this particular group, they were all Muslim. Yeah. And, they would like actively try to like convert me. Yeah. Or not even like actually convert me, but just like, well, miss, like the Quran says this and this is this and, this is what it is. This is how it is. Like let us teach you. Right. And I actually loved listening to them, and I loved learning their perspective. And there was one kid in particular, and I have reached out to him like with this current ongoing conflict, and I think it's always stood out to me as such a powerful characteristic, but also just like so hard for me to fully comprehend, is like this child would like look out into the hillside where like, I look out and I would see like literally from our school, you could see the wall. Yeah. You can see like piles of garbage that aren't being picked up, even though this is technically in an area where the Jerusalem municipality should be picking up trash. Yeah. And he would look out and say, like, but miss, look at how beautiful this world is that, like, Allah has made for us. Yeah. And even now, like, when I reach out to this one specific kid and ask him, like, how are you doing? How's your family doing? And he just has so much faith. Mm-hmm. And that's really what gets him at least through this. And I don't think it's exclusive to him, but it's really difficult for me to kind of comprehend this balance of this God that can cause this destruction,
Mm-hmm.
as we're talking about. And, I mean, yeah, has this ability to cause this destruction, but there's still this faith that somehow God will get you through this.
Right. Right. Well, and I think there's a few things to that. So I think part of the people, for those of us who do have faith in God, is that, I mean, I'm not going to speak for all of us, but like specifically with this story, is that and I'll speak for myself, like I don't believe God caused this destruction. Like even if we go back to the historical kernel, I don't believe that God would say, I am going to flood and kill a bunch of people to prove some sort of point. I do believe that God created a world where floods happen.
Mm-hmm.
And if you do a little bit of ecology, you know that floods are actually very important to our ecological development. And if you listen to indigenous populations, they know how to live in areas where floods and hurricanes and things happen. They know when to seek higher ground and when to come back. They know how to build agriculture that can withstand or that can be rebuilt, all of those things. So when we look at these cataclysms and we go, but look at all those people that died of an earthquake, it's like, well, because we built a city on top of a fault line where there should have never been a city with 10 million people in the first place, right? So I don't think that God is intentionally like saying, I'm going to kill a bunch of people. Right. I think that God created a world, a natural world where floods, earthquakes, things like that are a part of it. And as participants in this world, we're supposed to nurture that and learn how to live with it like our indigenous ancestors have. The other piece is that there's an ecological piece to this that we gloss over completely. Right. Floods and all those things, when they increase and when they happen more aggressively and more frequently, it's often because of human intervention. And it's often because of the
100%.
way that we mistreat God's creation. And so I think for me, a very purposeful way to interpret this scripture is to interpret it as human beings losing their connection to creation, mistreating God's creation. And the consequence of that, not because God is intentionally saying, I want to kill a bunch of people, but because this is the natural order of things, is that if you don't take care of God's creation, you end up being victimized by it. That we see that all the time. If we take care of God's creation, it flourishes and it nourishes us. When we don't take care of God's creation, we get greenhouse gases and smog and things that kill us. So I think that's a really strong lesson that is almost completely ignored in the American church. Like this idea that
I definitely never would have
the flood
thought about it
perhaps is a result of human intervention in God's perfect creation that then causes something that harms the people, right? And so perhaps Noah's morality is, and it doesn't say this, it says that Noah was a farmer and that Noah was good with agriculture, but it doesn't like go deep into that. So maybe this is a little conjecture, but like maybe Noah's morality is that Noah knew how to treat the land in the way that God would have him to, and that's why Noah was able to withstand the storm, whereas the ignorant others were like were too full of themselves and their technology and their creations to understand that the earth is going to flood and that you have to do something to withstand that, and that it's a natural part of things. So that's some of that is personal and some of that is from readings and things, research that I've done over the years, and, you know, questions and prayer, all kinds of things that go to develop my personal spiritual relation. But that's also part of how I look at this story. So when you go back to your question of how people can have so much faith, and I'll just speak from a personal angle, I can have faith in God in times of destruction because I never look at God as the author of destruction. I just don't believe in God. And I know you can pick apart certain verses in all the scriptures and say, like, it seems like God authors destruction here, it seems like God authors destruction there. But this is, I think we talked about this a little bit last episode, like this is where your personal relationship to God has to come through. The God that I know on a personal level is not a God of destruction. So when I hear an interpretation of God being destructive, for me, that action is not of God, so I can't accept that interpretation.
So who would that be an action of then?
So for me, it's either us harming God's creation, or either our connection with creation or our connection with God in a certain way, or it's some other evil force that seeks to destroy. Right? Like,
So
it's
what do you mean by
other.
that, though?
I mean, the like stereotypical answer would be the devil. Like, and we probably have to do a whole episode on the devils. I won't just say like it's the devil, but like that, the idea that there is, as much as there's good in the world, there's also evil. And I don't think evil is of God, but I do think evil exists in the world, and I do think sometimes things happen and they're a result of evil. I don't necessarily think that's the case with natural disasters or cataclysm. I think that they are natural, and they serve purpose. We wouldn't be able to grow things if there weren't occasional floods, right? They make the land more fertile. They renew the land. Like, that's part of the purpose of flooding. In some agricultural societies intentionally flood so they can get good agriculture. So I think that flooding is a part of the natural order of things, and we need to live according to the natural order of things. And when we build a bunch of big cities and technology and just sort of ignore nature, we end up with these cataclysmic things. And it's a byproduct of us not living according to God's creation versus God literally saying, I'm going to kill everyone. So I think that's a part of it. And I also think that another thing that we can sort of wrestle with is something they call process theology, which is interesting in this.
I don't know what that is.
So process theology is a theology that says that God's self is a process. God starts off a certain way, but evolves over time. God changes.
Oh, well, you've talked about this before, yeah.
Right. And so if you look at this, it does represent God as trying something, it not working, and then God having to get better at creating, essentially. And again, that's uncomfortable for some people because you want to view God as being perfect at all times, all the time. And I vibe with that to some extent. But it is really interesting in the context of this particular story because you do see God essentially admitting to a mistake.
Yeah, well, and I do think that that's even a change from these first stories that we've looked at. And, okay, I guess you've talked, well, when we were talking about this before, like the story as a whole, and you view it as a story of morality. Is this element of morality that you've been talking about the only lens for which you see it as a moral story?
No, I think part of it is moral. I think part of it is, I mean, I guess this could be moral too, but part of it is ecological. And then I think part of it is polemic. And I also think the polemic isn't talked about enough. Like let's ignore the moral.
That's actually that is a part that I'm very curious about, and almost
like I would say like for a second, let's ignore all the moral stuff. And if let's say this story is only a polemic, I think that explains a lot. Like the idea that they would say, "Oh wait, there's this story that we all know that's about the flood." And I think it's important to recognize like we often view the Bible as like something that was written by like one dude. Like some dude was just sitting down somewhere and wrote this. But these stories evolved over time. Like so much so that we, especially in New Testament, research, we have like older versions of stories that are different from the ones that end up being translated into the scripture. Like, so we know that these stories continually evolve over time. And like, you got to remember they're written by entire communities. And even in this story, we can see that. Remember I was talking about in the creation episode how there's like the priestly account and the Yahwist account and like there's the Elohist account, and there's different goals of the different communities, and then they kind of converge those stories. You see the same thing here. Like and I wrote it down, like in verse, what's this? So this is Genesis 7:2-3. It says, take 7 pairs of clean animals.
I had some questions about
the
this,
mate and all of those things. But then if you look at Genesis 6:19-20, it says all living flesh, not just animals. And then it says take 2. Right? So there's a contradiction there. Some people say like, oh, that's just different parts of a different story. But again, we have that whole piece where one part of the story they're exclusively using Yahweh to say God, and one part they're using Elohim to say God. And we think that it's that same sort of two traditions that got mixed together, right? And so, like, I think that this really is, in large part, a story that communities have developed over time. It's always existed. It's just, think about, like, holidays. Christmas isn't something that just popped up one day.
Right.
A bunch of, like, if someone says, oh, where did Santa Claus come from? There's like 5 different cultural traditions that converge to create what we now think of as Santa Claus and Christmas traditions. It's the same thing here. There's probably a million iterations of this flood narrative that were floating around Mesopotamia, and over time they evolve, and you add different elements, and you add different elements, and you add different things, and then you put them all together, and we end up with this iteration of the story. And so I think over time there's a lot of people that, as they become to know Adonai, God, as their God, as the one true God, as they depart from polytheism, as they depart from idolatry, and as they really come together around this central monotheistic God, that they begin to reinterpret this story to represent God the way they know God. And I think that's a bigger part of it. And so their interest wasn't in saving God from God looking like a genocidal maniac. Their interest was in making God purposeful. So God doesn't create, if God is going to create genocide, right, it's not because he was annoyed one day. It's because of some moral
he saw
failure,
a mistake that had been made.
and then God is going to fix that mistake. And the last thing, it's very purposeful, and this is one thing that's different about the biblical account than the other accounts, that from the destruction comes creation and comes something new and something better. And I do think that is supposed to speak to the restorative justice nature of God, right? They are representing God as a God that will enact justice, but justice will be restorative. If God destroys, God will create.
I like that, and I hope that can apply in this context.
It needs to.
I hope that it
doesn't,
can.
but it needs to.
I hope.
Yeah.
I hope.
Yeah. I think we all hope. Yeah. But people have to adopt that. People have to adopt that ideology, and that's the struggle. So many people's thought of God's justice is destructive and not restorative. And you see that play out here. God wants me to have this land. The only way I can get it is to destroy you, not to get together and restore what has been harmed. And so that's something that I think we as religious folk, whether it be it Christian, Muslim, or Jew, need to get better at.
I think that might be a good note for us.
Yeah.
To end on.
Yeah, no, it's good. As always, guys, if you're, we appreciate everybody following. We appreciate everybody that's been liking, that's been commenting. Comment more.
Seriously, we had so many comments from the first episode, and we loved it, and we want to know what you think, and happy to answer any questions. But yes, come follow us on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, all the things.
We had some good questions this time around, some deep questions, and I took my time to answer them. And even if it's something that you're like embarrassed to put on a comment, DM us. Put it in the DMs. Goes down in the DMs. Put it in the DMs and just let us know. And I'll I might take a day or two because I got to get my stuff together, but I'll definitely do my best to answer. And or even if it's a critique or something like that, like, and you don't want to make it public, we respect that. Just reach out to us, but we want to be as interactive as possible. Like, we have a lot of fun doing this, and we dedicate our time to put this together and make it something fun and thought-provoking for you guys. So